And whenever you're ready, Ben, please introduce yourself and your title and go for it.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I'm excited to present this here. It's sort of a combination of two different topics I've been thinking about and working on. So first off, my name is Benjamin Duester, or Ben, and I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher here at Göttingen University in Germany. I just moved here 2 months ago, and I'm working here in a project now that is focused on music research. So I am a cultural sociologist, and my main focus is in music. So what we're doing here is we are researching alternative epistemologies of music in the Western Pacific Island world. So especially I'm interested in this space in how land has been stolen through colonial practice, for example, or in the case I'm researching on the Marshall Islands. It's been also used for atomic bomb tests. And I'm interested in how music and sound, especially, for example, through things like salins, but also radio stations and so on, can be used as a way to, for once, reclaim the space, understand the space again. And I guess the newest challenge also in terms of facing, the challenges of climate change and the sort of disputed idea of sinking islands as well, how the space needs to be renegotiated and how do people need to migrate because of climate change, and how does sound inform our sense of space, and how does music, for example, prayer and so on, help to maintain our well-being while facing these problems, I guess, especially in areas that have also had a tradition of like moving to the United States, for example, for work opportunities and education and so on. So there's also diaspora research included in that. And besides that, I am interested in music and materiality. So what I will do today is trace a bit, like explain, how I came to this spot where I am right now, seeing myself as a cultural sociologist who mainly researches music, but also skates. So that's like my passion, I guess. I rediscovered skating around 2019, just before the pandemic, and it has been incredibly helpful as well to maintain well-being and I guess get exercise during times when it wasn't possible to really engage in groups, for example. So skating is still in my life, and it's getting more and more important, which is really interesting to think of and think back how important it was when I was 16, for example, and then I kind of got frustrated with it because of the social sort of cliques and so on. And now finding my way back into it, it's really exciting, and it's really exciting to see what is happening in skateboarding. So tracing my way also means acknowledging that I did my work in the past 5 years also on stolen land, which is still indigenous land and always will be indigenous land. So I did my PhD in Australia, and in Australia, and I would argue in any country with a settler colonial history, it's very important to acknowledge the traditional custodians and to acknowledge the land and the connection to land. And to respect this, I want to start off with this quote by the late and great Bobby McLeod, who was a tremendous musician, but also poet, who said, "When the earth is sick and polluted, human health is impossible. To heal ourselves, we must heal our planet. And to heal our planet, we must heal ourselves." So in the sense of this multi-connectedness, I guess I want to present to you today how I came to this idea of green pressure. So I already said that I was doing my PhD on music and materiality, and more specifically, I did my PhD on cassette tapes. And I think maybe there's like two type of topics you can do for a PhD. There's like the one topic where, you know, you tell somebody what you're doing and it just like goes right over their head and they just look at you. It's like, okay, I got no clue what you're talking about. Or you maybe have a topic that people resonate with. And I had the privilege to research a topic that people resonated with. Sometimes they resonated positively, sometimes they resonated negatively. But usually when I told them what I was doing, you know, something will come out. And interestingly, my friends also, yeah, they picked up on that. And every now and then, you know, if they would see something, they would send it to me. Something they thought was funny, for example, like, you know, just like oddities or novelties, like these B-side coffee beans, which are hilariously overpriced for what they are. But by the time I had to write my conclusion, which you might know it can be quite a daunting task. It was a really good timing because one of my friends sent me this article here by The Guardian, which says, "Rubbish mixtape fan reunited with cassette 25 years after losing it." Which sounded as a title quite intriguing. It sounded way different than what I was used to read about cassette tapes, because it was all about this like narrative of like, oh, cassettes are back, are they the new vinyl, and so on, and like really corny things. But this, it just stood out because it was something different. And once I read the entire article and what it actually was about, I was quite honestly, I was floored. So what is this about? It tells the story of Stella Wedel, a woman from Germany who was reunited with an old cassette tape that she had lost 25 years ago. So what happened was that she was traveling through Spain in the early 1990s, and she then accidentally dropped the cassette into the ocean, which in pretty much any case is like an instant irrevocable loss, right? But against all odds, she actually rediscovered this long lost tape in a recent art installation by the British artist Mandy Barker, who specializes in composing her works from marine debris that she collects from beaches. So Barker had picked up the tape on a beach in Lanzarote in Spain, had it restored, made playable again, and then included it in her exhibition, which is called Sea of Artifacts. So we can see Mandy here at Lapsangwan Beach in Hong Kong, checking out some of the marine debris that has been washed up on the shore. And on the right, we can see the result of her work. So it's like these mandala-esque collage pieces that sometimes are even arranged to specific topics. To illustrate, I got a couple here. So for example, this one is called Soup Refused, and it primarily consists of artifacts that display some kind of mark of chewing on them, or maybe ingesting as well. In a similar vein, we got this piece here, which is simply called 276. And it reminds me of something like a medical, you know, maybe a scientific or like an archaeological documentary of findings. And indeed, this is actually what it is, because all of this is the stomach content of a single 90-day albatross chick. So a dead albatross baby basically had all of this stuff inside its stomach. And possibly my favorite is this one. It's called, it's a pretty tongue-in-cheek name. It's called Penalty the World. And it's a piece consisting of 769 marine plastic debris, footballs and pieces of footballs collected from 41 countries, from 144 different beaches, and by 89 members of the public in just 4 months. So this swarm that we see here was collected only over a period of 4 months. And looking at it, I think there is like a hypnotizing moment to these pieces. It's of course like this kinetic composition, but it also reminds me of like this playful density that Martin Hanford uses actually to compose his Where's Wally paintings. Maybe some of you know them as Where's Waldo paintings. I just recently learned that they have all types of different names over the world. There's also this form of historic art of painting, which is called Wimmelbilder, which is from Germany. It's like a Renaissance style of painting practiced by Hieronymus Bosch, for example, like depicting the hell, for example, hellscapes and so on, which is maybe in a similar vein. But again, I think the sea of artifacts are these like intimidating swarms in comparison of colors and shapes. And at its core, it creates this like hypnotic campfire stare-like aura because it retains the semiotic traces of the contained fragments former life. So I think we get attracted to staring at this because some of these artifacts are identifiable, while others are not really. But in any case, I think looking at it, we can understand that each of these items has a history, and it can tell us something about how we consume and how we engage with the material world surrounding us. So the question then is, what can we actually learn from this? I think there's two main aspects here that we can consider it. I think for once, this story is not only giving credit to the emotional strength of music and materiality. So there was this memory, for once there was this memory of a playlist, and then there was this memory of the materiality of the cassette tape, you know, like what it looked like. And this was strong enough for Vidal to be like instantly remembered when she walked into this exhibition, to identify the cassette tape amongst all these like other items that probably were on display there. But more importantly, the second part that is important here to keep in mind is that I think this story strikingly illustrates the resilience of the cassette main constituent, which is, of course, petrochemical plastic. And it's something that, you know, we know already, but it's also something that we easily forget. And that is plastic is tough. In fact, thinking about it and like looking at it now, given the fact that this cassette tape probably spent most of the past 25 years being pickled in salt water, and by the end of it, it looks like this when it's fished out of the ocean, and with a little bit of work is restorable to the point where it's actually playable again. I think this demonstrates that plastic is probably a lot tougher than we would like to admit to ourselves. And I feel this is also the point where I can form a connection to the dilemma that we face in skateboarding, because music and art has this material aspect to it, and so does skateboarding too. So the question is, what's the dilemma for skating? Well, to start off, skating means wearing through stuff, right? Material degradation is, so to say, inscribed within skateboarding's progress. You have to go through a couple boards and a couple pairs of shoes to get better at skateboarding. It's a given within the culture that we practice. But at the same time, skaters are not mindlessly wearing through stuff. Of course, there are like counter examples to it, like, for example, you know, this practice of unnecessarily focusing boards, I guess to alleviate, you know, the stress and pain of like not being able to land a trick and so on. But in general, skateboarding's culture is quite sensitive to describing this interplay between degradation on the one hand and skill and learning on the other. So the skateboards that accompany us then become maps of our skating. They become marked with these scratches and nicks and dings, and some of them are clearly identifiable, and maybe they can be even a source of pride, you know, like a crooked grind groove. I don't know how you feel about them, but I'm pretty proud of my crooked grind grooves. But others, processes, they are more mysterious, right? Like the slowly shrinking wheels over time, or the soles of our shoes that thin out over time. And it's not really something, because it's so drawn out, the process is so, it takes so long for these kind of things to happen. It's something that feels like more out of our control. So there's different layers to it, but there's also, again, this connection to skateboarding's culture and practice and its history too. And for example, Thrasher is an important part of skateboarding's history and its, I guess, identity too. And Thrasher is famous for having these catchphrases, right? And also marketing or heavily marketing these catchphrases. So skate and destroy, for example, is one of them. And it's, as you know, printed on countless stickers and shirts. And of course, I guess in this Thrasher ecosystem, it's somewhat of a corny command. But today I want to try and reinterpret this phrase actually as an acknowledgement. Because skating indeed is constant destruction, and irrelevant of whether skateboarders willfully destroy, their gear or spots, or whether they don't do that. I think it's important for us to keep in mind that from a material standpoint, skateboarding is completely unsustainable. However, there is a growing interest in sustainable options in greater society and within skateboarding's culture. And these have been reflected somewhat also within the industry as well. And so I think it's important to look at what the industry has produced so far. And what I argue here is that it has produced a discourse, actually, a form of fighting over what is, sustainability in skateboarding. It has brought something to the surface. And it's important here to talk about greenwashing as well, and to acknowledge the impact of greenwashing on skateboarding. Because greenwashing has been part of one of the most heated debates, I think, within skateboarding's recent history, which is the debate that revolves around the shoe brand Cariuma, for example, trying to gain foothold within the skateboarding's industry through aggressive sustainability marketing strategies, with things like including, vegan materials, or this idea of planting trees for shoes being bought. And of course, like this backlash or counterpart in this equation through the rise of this like industry watch and whistleblower commentator YouTube account and influencer Gifted Hater. First of all, I think it's important to ask, how can we grasp greenwashing though? Well, there's different approaches to greenwashing. It's been a concept that has been used a lot throughout the past decades, especially in academia. It's been like used and like regurgitated, and there's been different dimensions. So one approach could be, for example, through an earlier definition, for example, through the Oxford English Dictionary, which says that greenwashing is disinformation disseminated by an organization so as to present an environmentally responsible public image. However, academia sometimes has this tendency to sort of narrow things down to make them more specific. In some cases that can be helpful, in other cases it's actually what it is. It's just limiting, and it's prohibiting in a sense. So one of the more rigid definitions coming from the academic realm is by Leon and Maxwell, and they are saying that greenwashing is more like a selective disclosure of positive information about what a company is doing, always with the intention to create an overly positive corporate image. So the main takeaway, I guess, from this, first of all, is to see that greenwashing is there in skateboarding, and there is a discussion about what greenwashing actually is. And there's also a dispute over, who's participating in it, and actually who has the right to define what it means. And in the academic realm, there has been some publications, and I guess there's been some intellectual investment being made in pushing beyond that, like pushing out of the scope of actually narrowing everything down to being a facet of greenwashing. And who I was particularly inspired by is Frances Bowen, who in her work after greenwashing was creating this project of trying to see what actually we can get after greenwashing. So to say, if we create a post-greenwashing type of view of corporate environmentalism. So in a nutshell, what Bowen criticizes is this tendency towards increasingly narrow definitions of greenwashing. And she's saying that it basically relates explicitly to a firm's choice about whether and what to disclose. And what is getting lost in this like narrowing down is it's not a choice about the form and substance, about a firm's environmental actions in the first place. So these like more rigid definitions are basically talking about mostly about decision-making by corporations and not what they're actually doing for the environment. And Bowen wants to return to that and analyze these things. And with that, it's really important to see that, and that's her main concern, and she's doing that for the corporate realm. And I do that, I used her theory to extend that into the realm of do-it-yourself practice as well. She says that environmental activism has always a symbolic dimension to it. So it's in a sense inevitable that performing symbolically is inscribed in engaging in a sustainable practice. So anything we do in terms of like sustainable activism always will have this like symbolic dimension to it. And in some cases, this is helpful. In other cases, it's not helpful, but nonetheless, it's always there. So the question then is, how do we deal with that? How do we engage with it? And Bowen in her book says that in this context, we need tools. So we need a sensitivity to discern between wasteful distractions and the needed initial attempts to promote the solutions for the challenges that we face. And like I said, I talked about the sensitivity that skateboarders have already, right? That the sensitivity of like wearing through material things that we have to do as a process of becoming better in skating. We have this as skateboarders, but at the same time, there is this fight over the legitimacy of which tools to use to assess this like environmental practice or faked environmental practice of skate companies. And I would like to assess the symbolic benefit, for example, of Kariyuma's marketing campaign from a somewhat dialectical perspective, for example. So that means that we can acknowledge actually that Kariyuma and this like aggressive and corny marketing practice that highly relied on the clickbait habits of YouTubers such as John Hill, in correlation with this backlash from somebody like Gifted Hater, actually helped to elevate this like collective awareness on the overall role of sustainability in skateboarding. And it helped to bring the problem to the surface, so to say. So Kariyuma's marketing has, in a sense, become somewhat of a gauge for companies and skaters to clearly distinguish what is acceptable sustainable marketing and what isn't. Something like Etni's previous tree planting campaign was flying under the radar to achieve this. Kariyuma went all out to gain a foothold in skating, but Etni's, when they launched their campaign in 2011, so you can see it's quite an old campaign already, they already had the foothold. So they, so to say, had nothing to prove to like aggressively promote this. So the discourse surrounding sustainability in skateboarding has given us a basis of assessing industry practice. But I argue, and this is the topic, the title of this talk, it has also created pressure on individuals. It has created pressure on stakeholders and companies, or in short, it has created pressure on everyone. And that's what I mean by green pressure. And I could sit here and talk to you all day, or I could write, articles and books about it, but sometimes it just takes 3 panels in a comic strip to really bring across what the problem is. And I think that's like the genius of some artists that I will never achieve, but that I really respect and really cherish. So we can see, right, Mouse is talking to Turtle here. And first it's about being a good friend, and then suddenly it's about saving the entire world. And this to me really sums up well the problem of green pressure. So I wrote a recent publication on this, and in there I tried to define it as green pressure as the sum of all expectations towards positive environmental impact that are accompanying all circuits of production, distribution, and consumption. So one of my key concerns with this is to generate another analytical tool that acknowledges that this pressure is not only one-dimensional, but it's reciprocal, right? Green pressure is not only existing as expectations that are brought to us from the outside, but they also exist within ourselves as self-expectation that we create for ourselves, basically. And that's, you know, that's what we can see on Mouse's face here too. So while being inspired by Paul's, Clifton's, Indy's, and Brian's work on gray spaces, and also feeding a bit into the name of the panel that we had at the Stoke session, this is sort of a sketch of showing how green pressure can also tip over into gray pressure, I guess, because these this like pressure that we feel inside of us that is linked to this like self-expectation that like we need to do something if we care about the environment. It's easy to immediately hit a wall with this and have this feeling of hopelessness, helplessness, just in the face of this sheer overwhelming number of intangible problems and tasks that are necessary to ensure a sustainable future. And that's exactly the expression that we can see here on Mouse, right? Like it's this, oh crap. Like Mouse is not shrugging this off, like it's clearly visible that they're compassionate and genuine about this. And therefore, because they care, they are immediately hit by this realization and by this reality of the problems that are there. So the question then is, I guess, how do we face this, right? Like, what can we do with this? We acknowledge this and we have the sensitivity now. Well, what do humans do to solve problems? Mostly humans do invest work into creating something that can solve problems, right? We invent things, maybe material things or theoretical solutions, maybe on a political basis, maybe on a scientific basis, maybe on a community basis. With this, for me, it's important to also have an awareness of like, what kind of work do we actually want to invest? Because I fear there's also the trap of like thinking of work as something that is like linear, right? Like we have a problem, we invest work, and then we come to a solution. I think that's, in some cases, it can be helpful. In other cases, it's going to be a dead end and it's going to be limiting. So because of that, and this is, I guess, where the German in me comes to the surface, is I suggest adopting Hegel's notion of work in this context. And I know that, Hegel is not really an author or a philosopher that is accessible to many, but I'm approaching Hegel's work, so like his magnum opus, as they say, the Phenomenology of Spirit, through a particular reading by Richard Rorty. It's like his interpretation of Hegel's project in his book, Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, in which he states that Hegel's main project consists in giving us a language game that we can use as a tool to detect cruelty within the human environment. So based on this, Hegel's concept of work is primarily one of mental work or intellectual engagement, actually. He's not really thinking of hands-on stuff. But for me, the interesting bit in a dialectical sense here is that by working on a topic, working on an object, working on a problem, we as the subjects are shaping ourselves, which means that we are shaping our experience and our knowledge simultaneously with the shaping of the object that we are working on. So there's like this dialectical interplay between subject and object in Hegel's understanding of work that through synthesis then can lead to new insights and ideas for solving problems. And alienation actually is a really integral part in this process. So to develop solutions, it is actually necessary for us to be disgusted by plastic pollution, because there has to be a driver for action, right? So through actively engaging with plastic waste, that is playing around with plastic waste, we can come up with new strategies to tackle plastic pollution at large. So in a nutshell, I guess learning by doing is what I'm aiming at here. So I'm proposing that working with waste is actually playing with skateboarding's waste. And here, I'm also interested in ways that we can navigate this pressure that we constantly feel. So I'm interested in exploring the opportunities of appropriating skateboarding's waste through DIY strategies. And with this, I argue that a normalization of small-scale DIY practices that ongoingly, shape themselves and shape objects and so on, repurpose waste, it has the potential to lead to large-scale solutions of pollution. And we see in these projects that repurpose, for example, the wood from skateboard decks, that there is there's also an industry initiative hidden in there. Like there's this sort of like connection between what people do in their garage, and once they become a bit bigger, maybe they can expand from there. For example, we have like Wobi Design, which is Ben Pike, and I think he's based in LA, who's building this like beautiful furniture out of old skateboard decks. Or we have the brand Victim, which is based here in Germany, which I understand from their social media posts, a growing company, and they're like making these like phone cases, for example. I'm testing this one right now. It's holding up great. And we can also see this in like from a like proper skateboarding corporate side with like the Real Life Wheel campaign or project that Satori has initiated, where they use the core of used wheels and form like an outer shell of new urethane and sell those as sort of like, half recycled skateboard wheels. So to bring like intersectoral solutions to the table, I think it's necessary to normalize this playful experimentation with waste and foster this like, inspiration within the community and within the industry. And I think that crossing over from one form of expression and leisure into the other is extremely important when addressing sustainability. We can see this here with this guitar, for example. So again, this German brand Victim, who are doing the phone cases, they teamed up with this German guitar manufacturer Bugley, who are specializing in making guitars with aluminium necks. And they created this guitar also made from, repurposed skateboard decks. And like the sea of artifacts, we can see like the traces of the boards in the guitar. And I think that's certainly an aesthetic choice, and it's kind of a novelty thing. And it's not everyone's cup of tea. But in the end, it's a maple guitar. So it's going to feel, it's going to weigh, it's going to sound and play like a maple guitar does. But also that means, acknowledging wood is not really the biggest problem that we face with skateboarding, right? It's like more about the urethane, for example, and the rubber of the shoes and so on. So what about plastic, for example? Well, things like, acrylic guitars have been around since the 1970s. And there has been recently a growing interest in these like guitars made from, I guess, unusual, built from unusual materials, like not wood guitars, for example, that also include aluminium necks. So students and researchers at Monash University, for example, teamed up to build a guitar that is made from recycled plastic. So at least the body you can see here is made from plastic. And again, like aesthetically, there's this novelty factor to it. But same thing like the skateboard guitar, like if people don't dig how it looks, it could be painted over and it would just look basically like any other guitar. And I think that's where the potential lies. Okay, There's one more slide where I talk about or nerd out about guitars. I hope you you hang in there. So one thing, that's something I encounter personally. So this is like me, you know, personally speaking now. There's been like, for example, Fender guitars, like the vintage ones that are like from the 50s and 60s. Some of them come with the so-called tortoiseshell pickguard, which is made of cellulose. They have all types of problems, but the cool thing about them is that they have this, like, they appear to be like multi-layered, because it is actually different layers of like cellulose being stacked on top of each other. So looking at it, they're quite beautiful because they have this depth to them. And so when you buy a new guitar, which comes with like a so-called tortoiseshell pickguard, you get this sort of like fake wood grain thing where, you know, you just get a piece of plastic and they like print this sort of like, you know, texture illusion thing on top of it, and it just looks awful in my opinion. So I was thinking, you know, isn't there a way to just like make something like that from mixing like different types of plastic together? Like surely that would be, you know, something that looks cooler. And lo and behold, I found something on the internet. Like as far as I understood, that's not something that is being sold, but it clearly demonstrates that something like that is possible. And to me, that looks much more interesting than like this sort of, you know, thing that tries to emulate what was before it in a fairly bad way. But to stop the guitar nerddom and not upset the other musicians as well. So some of you, maybe there's some drummers of you who know these like practice pads that drummers use to practice their paradiddles, for example. And it's, you know, it's literally just a pad of rubber. So again, my thinking is like, it's probably possible to make something like that from like shoe rubber, right? Like from old shoe soles. So I think that there's a lot of potential there if we, again, like, you know, break the boundaries between like different forms of expression and art and leisure, and just like start normalizing these things. And we can also do this in a larger scale, you know, just like briefly mentioning this. Like these floorboards, for example, this is stuff that I grew up with. Like my parents still have them in their flat. And again, I think it's important to remind ourselves, like, this is a piece of plastic, and humans seriously take a photo of wood grain and like slap it on top of that and call it a day. And then, you know, like you can imagine you live in a cabin with like wooden floors or something like that. But it's newly made plastic, right? Like, and that's really problematic. So there's been campaigns like, for example, the precious plastic movement. And they do things like key rings, you know, small things. Like I got one here. I'm testing that as well. I've had that I'm using it every day. I had it for maybe 1.5 years now, and it's holding up pretty well again. Plastic is really sturdy. But they are also producing things like bricks that you can build walls from. And again, like the guitars, you know, it's really in your face and it has this novelty thing to it. But again, it's, you know, it's a wall. Like if you don't like it, you can make it look plain white and boring like any other wall. It's possible. So I think there's really not really like a reason to keep using materials that are, especially if they're like petrochemical materials that are not recycled, while I think it is also impossible. It is also important to think about how can we move away from narratives that are actually limiting ourselves. So what I've illustrated is, I guess, the potential for further expanding a political ecology of skating, if we want to call it that way. So that is through accepting the alienation from plastic and actually engaging with the problem, engaging with waste, and engaging with this like disgust that we feel when we see plastic waste. If we engage with that in a playful manner, I think we can find solutions. So in the sense, it's necessary to normalize the reuse and upcycling of plastic and move away from the novelty factor. And I think we also need to move away from this like greenwashed narrative of like saving the planet through buying products that are made from recycled plastic. I think this is a limiting narrative that is not really going to lead us anywhere. And it's just costing us a lot of energy, actually, that we could use in other areas. Because altogether, I believe in the creative capabilities of the human mind, especially for problem solving. And to tackle plastic pollution at large, we need to work and we need to play a lot more with plastic waste in the future. And to promote that, and one way we plan to address this with our SHRED network is through the Green Pressure Zine. So the idea behind this is to create a decentralized zine to be distributed to local skate shops, youth centers, record stores, and other platforms that will function as a way to introduce people to the concept of creatively appropriating skateboarding's waste. So it will feature spotlights on different artists, activists, skaters, researchers, and it aims at being a source of inspiration that consciously acknowledges green pressure and the pressures that we are exposed to and that we expose ourselves to, while at the same time not overly, trying to point fingers and creating more pressure. Like that's the point of it, like inspiring people without creating more pressure unnecessarily. And while doing that, something that the zine tries to encapsulate is turning this illustration on its head. Because I think at its core, it doesn't end with the third panel, right? Green pressure means that we actually constantly are moving between panel 2 and 3, right? We constantly move from one day to the next between feeling content and feeling in control, and then feeling overwhelmed and feeling lost and feeling out of control the next day. And I think that's a condition it's not going to change anytime soon. But I also think it doesn't mean that we need to fiddle our thumbs in apathetic desperation. Thank you very much. I got a couple socials and references here in case that's interesting for you. But thank you very much for listening.